Hey, how's it going? This is Hellbent and welcome to tutorial number 4 from my AutoHotkey tutorial series. In this one we're going to be looking at functions and how we use them. First we'll start off by saying that what a function is. So basically a function is going to be a mini program within our program. The way this becomes useful is, let's say we have a block of 10 commands. Alright, and we're going to be using these same 10 commands or this same bit of code over and over again throughout the course of our program. Now we could write in our program those 10 lines every time we need it, and if it's 100 times we can write it into our program 100 times. But what we're going to end up with is a script or a program that's going to be 10 miles long, and it's going to be impossible for us to actually read our program. So instead what we can do is we can create a function that's going to contain those 10 bits of code, and every time we actually need to use those, instead of writing the 10 lines out, we can just call to that function and have it execute and then go back into our main program again. So that's the main use for our functions. Another way that functions are useful is with conserving memory. So your computer, even if it has like terabytes of memory, of RAM, it is a finite amount, and eventually there'll come a point where you don't have any memory available anymore. So by using functions, what we can do is we'll end up using local variables which take up an address of memory or take up some of the memory of your computer. We can use local variables that once they're done being used, it'll actually free up that memory so something else can use it. So let's say if we have one variable that we know that we have to have. We have to use this variable throughout the whole run of our program, or a series of variables that we know that we have to use throughout the running of our program. They're automatically, we know that they need that memory. But we might need to manipulate those variables in ways that the manipulations that we do to it, so let's say we can multiply it with other things. So let's say pi, for example. So in a function, we can assign a variable, a local variable, the value of pi, pass in our variable to that, multiply our variable with pi, and then leave the function, and the value the space and memory that the variable that's holding the value of pi, it can be freed up for something else to take its place until it's time for us to use that pi variable again. It'll get reinitialized, it'll take up that memory again until it's done being used, and then it'll free it up again. Right? So that's one of the main reasons also why we need functions. So let's jump into it. In order to do this tutorial, I suggest you have a fair knowledge of variables, or at least some working knowledge of variables. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a function. Now creating a function is very much like creating a label or creating a variable. So when we name it, we want it to be something that makes sense and it can't have any spaces in its name. So we can use we can use lots of words in its name, and in fact that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to call my function my first function. Now this is a case where it's not a very good name for a function. For our purposes it works okay, but for the most part you don't want to name it something like this unless this really it makes sense for some reason. So you want to name it something that makes sense, so that way when you're going through your program or when you have to make calls to it, and I'll show you that in a minute how to call it up, you don't have to go searching for the name. So if you have a name that really makes sense and that you're able to remember it, every single time you have to make a call to it, you don't have to go digging around looking it up, because making calls to functions, it does get a little bit repetitive, and it gets a little bit tricky if you don't know what the name of it is. So you'll have to go 100 lines down in your code, find out what the name of the function is, and then call it up. But like I said, for our purposes, this is fine. And when I'm doing these tutorials, I don't want to spend the time trying to think about these kind of things. So it's kind of a case of do as I'm saying that what you should do, rather than do what I'm doing. So do what I say, not what I do. Okay, so now that we have a name of our function, we have an open and close parentheses, and then we're going to drop down and create a open and close French brace. Now, so this is our function, and anything that we want it to do, we'll put inside of here. And it can be literally hundreds of lines of code, it could be thousands of lines of code, or it could be 2 lines of code. It could be 1 line of code. It could be no code at all. Right? Now, because it's easy, the easiest way for me to show you what is going on with these kind of programs, all I'm going to do is I'm going to use a message box. Now, chances are, when you're creating your functions, obviously a message box isn't going to do. But for the teaching of this, it's easiest for me to show you with a message box, so you can actually see where in our program what's going on in our program. So I'm just going to create a message box, and it's going to say I am in the function. Okay, so we have our function, and if we were to actually run our program right now, it's not actually going to do anything. And in order for this function to actually work, in our main program, or our main script, what we need to actually do is call it. And the way we call it is we just use its name with the open and close parentheses. And there's more to it, but we'll get into that in a few minutes. But just basically, we're going to use its name. And open and close, and then that's it. So let's say we have a whole bunch of code up here. We have, a bunch of lines that are doing different things, and then we need our function. We call our function, and then below that we can go back to doing our normal program. Now, how this works is, as soon as it encounters this, it's going to jump inside of the properties or inside of our function and start executing the lines of code that is in it. Once it gets to a return or an exit or this close French brace, then it's going to go back into our main program and continue on until it encounters an exit or a return. Okay, so here we go. We have our first function. We've created it. We've made a call to it. We save our program and we run it. And there we go. We have executed our first function. Now, let's look at, I'm going to expand on this just a little bit. I'm going to create a message box here. Message box. Okay, so I have as soon as our script starts, it's going to pop up a message box that says that we're in the main program. Then I'm going to pass it to the function. It's going to execute that, and then I'm going to create another message box that says and I'm going to do one more function. So to save time, I'm just going to copy this, paste it in, and I'm going to alter a few things. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to, rather than putting my second function, rather than calling it up here, rather than doing that, what I'm actually going to do is show you that you can make calls to other functions within functions. So once it goes into the first function, it's going to pop up the message box, and then it's going to go make a call to the second function. It's going to go and execute the properties of the second function, and then finally it's going to go back into our main program. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and save it. Okay, so here we go. It says it is in the main program. Next, it's going to jump into our first function and give us our message box. So it's now in the first function, and now it's in the second function, and now it's back in the main program. So as you can see, you can make calls to other functions within functions. Okay, I hope that's clear, and we will move on. So I'm just going to comment out. Actually, you know what? I haven't been saving my tutorials, so I'm going to get rid of this. Okay, next what we have is passing variables into a function. So like I said, one of the main reasons why you're going to be using a function is to actually do operations in it on variables. So in this case, we're going to create a variable, and like I said, I'm not very good at naming things while I'm doing these tutorials, so I just usually pick the first thing that pops to my head and I run with it, rather than sitting here for a minute or two trying to think of something. Because I end up, instead of thinking of what I should be thinking about, I think about other things. Now I need to create a function. And in this case, I'm just going to call it function1, just to save a little bit of time. Okay. Now, when I had gone over the variable tutorial, I had told you about scope and how things are local or global. This is a case where we're going to have two local variables here, basically. And so, if I was to use this name inside of this function, it would actually be two different variables. Even though they share the same name, what they're doing is they're pointing to a place in the memory. So let's say that this computer screen is my computer's memory. This variable name might point to this spot up here for those, okay, actually here. So it might point to this location in my memory and say that the value that's stored there is hellbent. Right? So at this location in memory, it says that name points to this location and it says it equals hellbent. If I was to use name in here, though, it might point to another location and say that it means something else. So even though I'm using the same variable, I can use name in here and here, they point to different places that hold different values. Even if they held the same value, even if this location held hellbent as well, they're still pointing to two different locations, because even though they have the same name, they're not the same variable. Okay? Now usually it's a good idea not to name them the same thing, but you could if you needed to. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say that this function requires a variable to be passed into it. And we're just going to call that variable x. And then what we're going to do inside of our function is we're just going to pop up a message box, because once again it's the easiest way for you to see what's going on. Okay, but like I said before, it could be hundreds of lines of code. It could have passes to other functions, and those functions could pass to other functions, and so on and so forth. Okay, next what we need is we need to have a call to that function. So function1, and then we're going to pass the value, we're going to pass our variable name into it. Okay, let me see. Okay, I think we're good. So here's how we pass a value into a function. When we create our function, we say that we're expecting a variable to be passed into it, and then when we make our call to it, we place the variable that we are going to be passing to it. So, okay, so here we go. We've displayed the value of x. And to go back a bit to show you what I was talking about, let's assume that we weren't passing any variables into it. If I was to go and try to print out the value of name, because this function, everything in this function can't actually see the contents of that variable, this is not going to have any value, because this is actually a different variable that doesn't have any value. And we can demonstrate that right there. So as we can see, name has no value because it doesn't know what that is. These are two different variables. Okay, so like I said, that is how we pass a value into a function. So, okay, and we can pass as many values as we want. So we have name right now, and what I will do quickly is I'll create a couple new variables. Okay, and all we have to do is put a comma and then the next variable we're going to be passing until we get to our last variable. And likewise we have to do with this. So let's do okay, so it doesn't matter what these names are because they're not really related to that, and we'll just pop up their values. So X, Y, Z, and S. Okay, so this is how we pass multiple values into a function, and there we go. A1, 2, 3. Okay, easy stuff. Moving on. You know what, I'm gonna okay. Next is returning a value from a function. And yeah, I got enough time for this. I'm right at that border point where this video is going to get a little bit long, but if I put this off till the next video, then the next video is going to be really long. So, okay, returning a value. So it's basically the same way that we do the passing. So let's just create some variables. And then we'll create our function, and we're going to be passing two variables to it, so we know that. And we will use X and Y. And we'll do a mathematical operation. But first, let's look at how we get our return. So now that we know that we want something back, what we're going to do is we're going to say that the variable that we want to store the return value, so we're going to do a mathematical operation in here, and we're going to say up here, we're going to say that the value that we get from that is going to get stored into a variable. So just like how we do this here, or we declare our variables like that, we're going to declare that C equals whatever we get back, the return value from our function. And we're going to pass it A and B. So C is going to equal whatever we get returned back from when we pass these values into our function. Now what we're going to do is we're going to say in our function, now we can do a lot of different things in here. It doesn't have to be only what we're going to be doing right now. There's different ways that we could do it. We could have our math done in a whole different way. But because we only have one line that we need in here, that's all we're going to do. But in your program, it might not be so easy as just returning an X plus a Y, or so on and so forth. But we're going right to the punch. This is what we were expecting it to do. So we're going to say return, and then what do we want? We want X. Do we want X times Y? Do we want x minus y? Do we want x plus y? Do we want x plus y times pi to the square root of whatever? Okay, so there's multiple things that we can do in here. This is just a very simple example, and you can play around with this to see what you can do with it. Okay, so here we go. We've made the call to our function, and we're going to get a return value, and we're going to assign that to the variable c. We'll run our, and I guess we need a message box to actually display that. Message box, and we're just going to print out our c. Okay, so there we go. We've passed 1 and 2 into our function, and then we've added them together, and we output 3. Likewise, we can change that to multiply, and I guess we're going to get 2 this time. Okay. We can also do, like I said, we can also do other things. Let me get some bed mass in here. Okay. And there we go. Okay, so that's it for this part. Come back and we'll finish. We'll go to passing by reference and test how you can use this for testing and a bunch of other little tricks that'll make your programming experience much easier, much less problemsome.